Now, if any photographer ever tells you that they're going to be able to teach you to mirror or copy their style of photography, frankly, they're lying. What's up, guys? If you haven't met me yet, my name is Luke Pelli. I'm a photographer, filmmaker, and artist, if you want to call it that. And yeah, I am going to call it that. Now, what I can promise you is that I'm going to be able to give you the tools and tips to be able to go out and develop your own style of photography. Now, this podcast is also going to be in video form because if you have a short attention span like myself, you need visuals to keep you engaged. Episode 1 is going to teach you how to get comfortable with your camera. We're going to go over all the different settings, all the different dials, your exposure triangle, your aperture, ISO, shutter speed, how those affect your images. Episode 2 is going to be focused on shooting. So this is the fun one. You understand your camera, now you're going to go out and shoot with it. And it's all going to be based around lifestyle photography because I think that that's how everyone gets started. Now, episode 3, the most overlooked step, and probably the one that the majority of you guys are going to skip if you're just starting out, but it is your post-processing. So editing your photos. First, we're going to get you comfortable with your camera, then we're going to go out and shoot with your camera, then finally we're going to take those photos, figure out how we can get the most out of them, and then be able to share them to whoever you want. With all that being said, I'm proud to introduce my guest today. He's my brother. His name's Zack Pelli, and he recently just bought his first camera. Is that right?
That is correct, and I taught you everything you know.
Okay. So while he is older and smarter than me, I'm obviously the handsomer brother, and I know more about photography, where the handsome part isn't relevant, but the photography part is for this podcast. So, okay. So you recently bought your first camera because you were going on a trip. Can you tell me a little bit about why you decided on that camera and why you want to pick a camera up?
Sure. So this camera is the A6400, I think that's an A. Actually, I'm not actually sure. Yeah. It might be an alpha.
It's an alpha, yeah, but okay. A6400 is
okay, so an A6400, and it is made by
Sony.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I'm a little new to this whole photography aspect, but yeah, the reason why I picked up a camera was because I do a decent amount of traveling for both work and for pleasure, but a lot of international when I can. Obviously, not so much in these last 2 years. But yeah, like typically going around, I would take a iPhone camera and take a whole bunch of pictures, and then I get back and be like looking through them, and I just really wanted, say, this picture to be blown up and thrown on a wall. And every time I say, "Hey Lou, what do you think about this picture? Can you print it out for me and put it on a wall?" And you go, "No, it is an iPhone picture. You can only do it to about the size of a printer paper." Yeah. And that's about it. So wanted a nice camera that I could take like good landscape shots, some good picture shots of me and my wife. Yeah, so that's the reason why we bought it. And obviously we had a trip coming up because we were in Italy about a month ago for our honeymoon.
Awesome. So you told me you want to get a new camera. You asked me to teach you a little bit about photography. So we headed out to the camera shop in Philly, the local spot, Unique Photo. Shout out to you guys if you're watching. So we went to that shop, and you want to bring me along because you weren't sure exactly what type of camera you wanted. I remember you first said you were dead set on a DSLR because you like being able to look through the viewfinder and be able to see the image, and I tried very hard to get you to get a mirrorless camera.
Which you succeeded.
I did, yeah.
I think.
Yes, it is a mirrorless camera.
Okay.
Because I feel like for beginners, mirrorless cameras are both easier to learn because there's more automatic settings that can help you out, and you also get more for your money. So you had a set price point, and we could look at cameras within that where you get the most bang for your buck. So we settled on the A6400. You looked at some Canon cameras, held them in your hand. And I always recommend for someone who's buying a camera, try and go to a store so you can hold it in your hand because the ergonomics of cameras are so different. You want to make sure that you're comfortable holding it for a long day. And you're comfortable using it. It's not too big, especially if you're traveling. So just weigh your price point with the specs that you want, and then also the ergonomics and the size. So you held a bunch of cameras, and I recommended the A6400 for the main reason being I have all Sony cameras. So I have a ton of lenses that you could potentially use in the future, and that's one of the best things about the Sony lineup is Canon has a bunch of different lenses for every camera versus Sony, their whole thing is one lens mount system to rule them all. So if you ever upgrade in the future, you can use your same lenses, which actually brings me to an important point.
Wait, so the other cameras, when you switch lenses, sometimes they don't work between cameras?
So Canon actually, the reason why I switched to Sony is for that exact reason. I had a Canon M50, but when I was looking at full frame cameras and then cinema cameras down the line, with Canon, they have their M lenses, which are for their small mirrorless APS-C cameras, and then they have an EF mount and an RF. So I'm like, I don't want to have to buy new lenses every time I get a new camera. You can sell your lenses and they hold their value well, but you're still losing money on that.
Aren't lenses like super expensive?
Mine are. APS-C lenses are probably like half everything that a full frame lens would cost. Because it's like a smaller sensor, so it doesn't need to cover like a huge piece of glass like those lenses over there. So yeah, so anytime someone's getting started, if they're thinking about upgrading in the future, I always say consider your lenses, because you don't want to have to buy new ones. So you ended up getting one of the kit options, which is a zoom lens. It's a 3.5 to 5.6 aperture, and it's a 16-50 zoom lens.
You read that.
I did not read that. I looked down and maybe read it.
All right, you might need to take a little bit of a step back. You said a lot of letters
yes.
Together, like APC. I think that was one of the things you said.
APS-C, yes.
APS-C.
So that's a good point.
Like
actually.
a PlayStation computer.
Yeah. So with cameras, there are a bunch of different sensor sizes. So APS-C refers to the size of the sensor, and you'll see here, if I take, sorry for our audio listeners, but if you're on video, you'll understand this more. If I take this off,
you broke it.
You'll see the size of the sensor, right? It's a small, I don't remember the exact dimensions, but it's less than half of the size of a full frame sensor. So that's your sensor size, and it's not really something that you have to think about at all if you're a beginner.
You're right in that I'm not going to retain a lot of that. I think most beginners that are in the stage that I am is you're going to get some sort of kit thing that feels good and that you like to shoot with, and then you got to figure out what to do with it.
So that's a good point. I won't dive into that because this is a beginner podcast. All I'm going to say is if you're getting a camera, look at mirrorless APS-C cameras. They're smaller sensors, cheaper lenses, smaller camera bodies.
So the things that like I want to know are even with like the same camera, your photos seem to come out way better than mine most of the time, but sometimes I have a few gems.
You did have a really nice photo from Italy that I
Thank you.
Stole to be able to edit it a little bit to take a look at.
It was the auto mode.
Auto, yes.
Yeah. No, it's actually not true. Actually, so the one thing that you did, so before going on this trip, when I bought this camera, remember when I said like, hey, you really need to teach me how to use this before I go on the trip? Yeah, it's a month after I got back from the trip, so I really appreciate that.
You're welcome. I told you a few things, and only a few of them you actually listened to.
Right. So one of them was ISO, which I guess has to do with the light level. So when I'm taking a picture and say like the camera or the light source, sun or something is directly behind what I'm trying to shoot, it gets really like washed out. Mm-hmm. So all I really picked up from that was I need to adjust the ISO. I don't know if that means up or down, but it took me probably half the trip to figure out what that was, because none of these say ISO on it.
That's true.
So I kept going. But when I pressed that, it didn't work that well.
Yeah.
All I learned is that if I went to the A mode and then just flicked this thing, the wheel, I could get it to go down and go really dark. So I remember you said it's better to shoot in dark than it is to shoot in light, because you can always brighten it. But if you shoot it in light and it overexposes it, then you can't get that detail back.
That's a good point.
And that picture, I'm pretty sure I had brought it down a little bit.
It was a little underexposed, which made it really good to edit with because it was kind of harsh sunlight.
Yep.
And just to be clear, you can't always bring back darker images if they're too dark, but it's easier to bring some information back when they're slightly underexposed. Right. So I never recommend like
super dark.
Exactly. But if you have to darken it as opposed to brighten it a little bit, you're exactly right. You want to shoot it a little bit darker because it's easier to boost up in post.
Right.
And the easiest way to boost that up is by shooting in RAW. Now, Zach, tell me a little bit about what mode you shot in for your files.
Well, I shot all of my photos, which was about 1,500, I think almost 2,000 photos, right?
Yes.
In the mode that you had set it for. Yes, you did. No. You're the one who did it.
Okay.
I don't know what I'm doing.
Tell us what you did, Zach.
I just shot the pictures.
Yes.
They just happened to transfer off of the camera in JPEG mode.
Yeah, so I remember distinctly one thing I told Zach before going to Italy. Well, shoot your photos in RAW, because if you have a really good one and you think that maybe it was a little too dark or a little too bright, I can edit it for you as long as it's in RAW.
Yeah.
And he comes back and 1,500 photos were all in JPEG. Now, it's unclear.
No, there was one that was in RAW, because I remember I was messing around with it.
Yeah,
but that was actually before I left. So.
Okay, so
I
every trip from Italy was in JPEG. And that's fine. To be honest, I shot in JPEG for the first 3 years before actually...
But it was like good JPEG.
Yeah, exactly. The photos are great, and a lot of that's because you did do a lot of things right while you were there, which I'll talk about. You did some things that I wouldn't have done, but you did some things right, like getting your exposure correct, and your white balance was pretty much set the whole time. And those are a lot of things that you would fix if it was in RAW. So for beginners, I always say shoot in RAW because you have more room for failure, more room for error. So you can always fix something if it's in RAW. So I told you to shoot.
When you're going to shoot perfect, I mean.
Exactly. When you're going to shoot perfect, just slightly underexposed or overexposed, then JPEG's fine. But I would say also, if you're not planning on editing your photos at all, it's okay to shoot in JPEG. I don't only think RAW is the right thing. It all depends on file size. If you're just transferring them to your phone, then JPEGs are fine.
Right.
But
which is what I do.
If you have a photographer brother who offered to edit them really nice,
you offered?
I did. I said I would edit them when you come back. Because your intention was to be able to print some out, put them on a wall. So I think in that scenario, shoot it in RAW, because then you can always have someone, or learn yourself how to edit them. And you'll find out how to edit in episode 3. So for now, we're just talking about camera settings. But in episode 3...
And did you change my camera setting to be in RAW?
The only thing I changed So one day you asked me...
No. Like today, did you change it to
I
RAW?
I did. Okay. Yeah, so once you got back, after the disappointment left my face, I changed it to RAW. But before you left, I didn't touch that at all. The only thing I touched was the size for sending it to your phone, because you said, why does it look better on the camera than when I send it to my phone? It doesn't look as good. And that was just your export settings on your phone within the app. But I should have, before you left, made sure your camera was in RAW. So I'll take 15% of the responsibility for that, as long as you hold on to the other 85%.
Yeah, it's like taking a test and then learning the class.
Yes. Well, at least you had the exposure to photography, pun intended.
Yeah. I will say, though, during the trip, which was 2.5 weeks, my photos got better as time went on.
Which is great to see.
Yeah.
And I agree. You were scrolling through the slideshow yesterday or a few days ago, and your photos were definitely improving, which is good because you did some things that to help yourself out. Like you talked about shooting in, what was it, shutter or aperture priority mode?
Huh?
You weren't shooting in auto. You were shooting in a different mode.
Yeah. So, all right. So since this is a beginner podcast, John, if I don't know what any of this stuff is, all I know is auto does it all for me. And if I go to I think it was A, actually. Hold on, let me check. Yeah, if I go to S, which is, I assume, sport mode.
No, but okay.
Yeah, I can change like the brightness with this.
Yeah.
Right? But this, it says, yeah, there you go. See? So if I was pointing at something that's a bright light, I would just make it darker a little bit.
Yeah, so you're changing your shutter speed right now.
Oh,
so
is that what that is?
Yeah, so this is actually a topic for today's episode, so thank you for the segue. So for beginners, the first thing I say after leaving auto is to explore some of the manual auto modes, which are those S, A, and P modes. S, which you described as sport mode, is shutter priority, which is actually technically sport mode.
Yeah.
Because when you're shooting sports, you want to, unless you're shooting in full manual, shutter priority is going to be able to preserve motion. So shutter priority, you set your shutter and everything else happens automatically. So your shutter isn't going to change while you're shooting. It'll adjust your ISO and your aperture.
So what does shutter do? Shutter speed, I imagine, is the close, right?
Yeah, so you're right. I'm going to touch on that before I talk about this because you need to know those three things first. So the first thing I want to talk about is exposure. And your exposure, it's called the exposure triangle because it's made up.
Right, that's light. I think most beginners would know that too. It's exposure. When something's overexposed, it's like super bright.
But this is going to help you understand why. So your exposure triangle is made up of your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO. So because it's a triangle, they all work in unison. So if you adjust one, it's going to brighten, but if you adjust the other, it's going to make it darker. But they aren't exclusively ways to control light. They have other effects. So when I describe what they do, you'll understand more what they're used for. So your aperture refers to the opening of the lens diaphragm, which is just like how open or closed, so how much light is being let in. And the lower the f-stop, or the aperture number, which is the like 1.8, 2.8, 5.6, the lower that number, the more open it is. So that's a little confusing because you think it'd be the reverse.
It's like gauges, wire thicknesses.
Yeah, so if you haven't guessed yet, he's an engineer. So your aperture is like how open is your lens. So obviously more open, more light gets let in. More closed down, less light. And then your ISO is your camera's sensitivity to light. So your ISO is the only part of the exposure triangle which just controls light. Everything else controls other stuff too. But your ISO is just like, imagine brightening an image after the fact. It's just like, oh, are we brightening it or are we darkening it?
Okay, so we talked about how F is for aperture.
Yep.
Because it starts with an F. And the lower the number, the more light it lets in.
Yes.
So how come when I change that, right? So I'm in A, which means that this little wheel is going to change to A, which is F. So if I go up, it's no different really than if I go down.
Is your ISO on auto? No, but your shutter, okay.
So why is it no different? This is one of those things that, like, as a beginner, I was like, oh, I remember aperture, which I think is an F thing, so I'm going to change that, and it's not different at all, so I'm going to do something else.
Yeah, let me take a look for a sec.
Yeah.
Because you're on aperture priority, it's going to keep the correct exposure. So aperture priority, everything's on auto except for your aperture. So when you change your aperture, it's not going to change the light because everything else is slowly changing to overcompensate or undercompensate. So
why would they do that?
Because if you want your aperture to be one thing and not worry about everything else, so say I'm taking portraits, so I want a super blurry background. I'll set my aperture to like 1.8, so a low aperture, very open lens. I'll set it to that. And then
you want everything else to still be auto?
Well, that's what that mode does. So if you're just starting out and you know, like, oh, I want a blurry background, I don't want that to change automatically.
All right, so portrait of you.
I
did. It's very, very slow. Look.
Yeah, it's because your shutter speed is
so... why was my shutter speed so low?
Okay, let me finish explaining shutter speed.
See, this is why I do auto.
I know, and I understand that.
So why was the shutter speed low, and how do I change it?
Because you were in aperture priority. So you cranked your aperture. So this is a perfect example of the exposure triangle. Because you were playing with your aperture, you made your aperture super closed down. Right. So your shutter had to say, ooh, I have to take a really long photo
in order to get the same amount of light. Yeah.
To get in the same amount of light. So that brings us to shutter speed, which is the third part of the exposure triangle. And your shutter speed is exactly what it sounds like. It's the speed at which the shutter of the camera closes.
Yeah.
And that brings us around the triangle to the third part. So your shutter speed, if you're taking sports photography, you want it to be a really fast shutter because that freezes someone in motion. But if you're taking like stars at night and you want the shutter to stay open or get like not a time lapse obviously, but a long exposure, you would open that up a lot. So what was just happening there is your camera was doing a long exposure, which you can't do handheld because you'll get some shake. And it was doing that to compensate for the over cranked aperture.
Okay. So to dumb it down a little bit more.
Yes.
I just learned what aperture was.
Mm-hmm. So what is aperture?
Aperture is the size of the hole.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's the same. So your exposure triangle, really you want to maintain the same amount of light that comes in, right? So it's either, as an engineer, think about a pipe, right, of water, right? If you close the hole to get the same amount of water at the end, you need to have it go for a longer period of time.
Okay.
Right?
Yes.
Right, so that's your shutter speed is the longer period of time, and the hole size is the aperture, right? And then your pressure would be probably the third part of the exposure triangle.
Yeah, it's all three things working to get the same result. So the result is a correctly exposed image. So now that you understand the three parts of that.
But sorry, the one thing I was going to ask though is if I want portraits, as a beginner, what I want to learn is if I'm taking a portrait versus a landscape, right? It sounds like for portrait, I want to crank my aperture down low, which is bigger.
Yes. So, and you're on a kit lens. So one reason I like primes is because you get a much lower aperture. So you get a blurrier background, and that's how aperture affects that. The lower this number goes, the blurrier the background, as it's called, or the more wide open the aperture can get. So this one can go, or actually not this one, but like those lenses can go down to 1.4 or 1.8, and because it's a kit lens, it only goes down to 3.5. So what that means is it's not going to be as blurry as like a prime lens. But yes, the concept that you're talking about is correct. For a portrait, and this isn't exclusive, like you can break the rules at any point, and these aren't necessarily rules, But like industry kind of standard is to have like blurry background portraits, depending on like if you're doing traditional portraits or environmental. Environmental, you want more of the background, so you include that.
Which makes sense. I mean, if your aperture is really big, it's going to get a lot of noise from a lot of things in it, so you only can focus really on the thing that's right in front of you.
So let me explain depth of field a little bit more concisely. So your depth of field, which is controlled by aperture, so the more wide open, the depth of field is like a cone. So as you open it up, the cone is a smaller point and only this much is in focus. As you close it down, the cone narrows, but the whole field is in focus.
It's like a cat's eye when they go predator mode versus...
Exactly. Yeah. Like, and when you focus on something here, everything else blurs out. But if I focus on it there, you're more in focus, I guess. So that's your kind of cone, and that's the best way for a beginner to learn is just think of it as a cone. So you know, am I opening or am I closing the cone? And then you'll know how much of the field is in focus.
Right.
So
what is that different than, I guess auto will automatically do it depending upon what I'm focused on, right?
Auto will automatically do that, but a lot of times it gets it wrong. Like it doesn't know, oh, this is a person or this is a landscape. It just knows, oh, it's darker or it's lighter here. Okay. So it's not going to like consider those things. And that's why like shutter and aperture priority do consider those things. It considers, he wants his aperture to be something and everything else will control for him.
So the types of things that like a beginner like myself who just kind of uses it to travel, but like also with people, so you want some good shots of each other, of like, you know, yourselves and together and stuff. There are like landscape pictures, like, oh my gosh, this beautiful church in Rome. And then there's like portrait, but I would say like more candid kind of stuff, like my wife like walking down the streets, you know, of like Siena or something.
It's like lifestyle.
Really cool. Yeah, lifestyle photography and stuff where they're like not really this close, but like, I don't know, 15 feet away or something, but you kind of want to focus on them with a little bit of the surrounding. And then I guess the third aspect would be, like straight up portrait, like out at dinner, like having a good time and like messing around and taking a picture of each other.
Okay.
And yeah, so all I really know during those is, one thing that beginners should know is when you take the shot, there's a halfway and a full way. Yes. I made this mistake because I had never used a camera before. It wasn't actually this trip, but I borrowed someone's camera for a friend's engagement when we were in France.
Okay.
And I didn't know how to use it, but I just assumed like point and click, right? And the pictures weren't coming out good, so I was manually focusing the entire time to hopefully try and get the pic. Well, we ended up just using the iPhone pics because none of mine were useful, and I felt really bad about the whole thing because I'd ruined their not ruined, but like they were hoping like, oh,
you ruined their marriage.
Yeah, they're still together, so it's okay. But yeah, so halfway down, focus.
Yes.
Full down, shoot.
Yes. So
beginners 101.
Okay, perfect. So
once we're there, then you can focus on other things, right? So yeah, like when I was doing a portrait, I would obviously focus on the person, but when I'm a landscape, you know, I'll hold it down on it. But the problem with landscape is a lot of like depth of view, so you really have to like pick what you want to focus on.
So there was kind of two questions in there. So the first one I'll talk about, you were saying landscapes. So for landscapes, you want to crank your aperture super closed. So you want everything in focus in a landscape. Yep. You don't want like that front tree in focus and then not the mountain in the background. So for that, I wouldn't necessarily just try and focus on one thing that's at that distance.
So is focus different than aperture? I thought that was...
Yes, they are different, but aperture allows more things to be in focus. So they work together. So for focusing, I would just use your camera's automatic focus. You don't want to have to manually focus like you were talking about. So when you're taking a landscape, what I would do is switch to aperture priority for a beginner. What I would do is manual, but for a beginner, switch to aperture priority. Put your aperture to like 11 or 15, and then try taking the photo. So that's narrowing your cone. So if here we're at 1.8, here we're at like 2, at like 22 we're like here. So everything is in focus.
And that's what this number, so 3.5, which is the lowest I can go?
That's the lowest it'll go.
But I can go up to 22.
Yeah.
That's not that number.
Huh?
22 is not that number.
That's not the range. That's just the lowest it'll go at this number and the lowest it'll go at that. So on a zoom lens, it's a variable aperture. So what that means is as you zoom in, the lowest you can go gets like higher.
All right, so we got the A.
Yes.
And sport mode is shutter speed.
Yeah, that's actually a really good way to think about it. So the S, just think of it as sport mode. So if I'm doing sports, if I'm doing, and it may actually be called that, but if I'm doing sports, right, I know I don't want the person
Things are
running
moving,
to
so
be
you want
blurry.
it quick.
Yeah. So the first thing you think of with sport is, fast shutter. And so your shutter speed is the thing you control there. So for that, you never want to handhold anything below 1/60 because your hand will shake so much. So I know that's confusing, but like when you have your camera on, you'll know what I'm talking about. So for everyone watching, if you have your camera, it's a good time to pull it out. So switching to sport mode here, see how that's 1/8?
Yeah.
That's going to be 1/8 of a second, which is
the amount of time that the
shutter,
which is a long time for shutter speed.
It's a long time for shutter speed, exactly. So
that's your long exposure. No, that we were way longer before.
We were at like 3 or 5 seconds for the exposure. So you never want to handhold anything below 1/60. So
wait, but that just said 60, not 1/60.
No, it is 1/60.
No.
It's showing that's the number.
That's the denominator.
Exactly. So this is 1/60.
You don't want to handhold anything over that number.
Yes. No, under that number. So anything slower than that number. So like 1/30. Well, technically, with fractions, it would be over.
Yeah.
Wow, what an engineer way to think of things.
Yeah. The bigger number is the more time that it's open, which means that it's going to feel that more, and you're going to get blur.
Which, if you're a beginner, just focus on the denominator. We don't have to engineer it here with decimals and stuff.
Asked.
But that's true, I did. So 1/60 is like the lowest I go for handhold, but for sports, you want like 1/1000. So that's a really fast shutter.
What's your standard everyday shot?
It depends on, because I'm a manual shooter, totally depends on the light.
What's my standard everyday shot?
I just wouldn't use shutter priority unless I was doing something with action. So
if most of the things that I would do would not, but then like if I see like a boat ripping by, like crank that bad boy up, which in your case is up, in my case is down. But the lower or the larger number, right, which is the denominator, so it's a quick shot.
And everyone should know that ISO should be the last thing you try and adjust, because that's going to introduce the most noise and degradation of the image.
See, I went for it as the first one.
No, so that should be the last one you adjust.
No.
Never, because that's going to have the most effect on image quality in the negative way. So that's pretty much everything that you would need to know just to get kind of more comfortable with your camera settings. I think a podcast is a hard medium for this because it's a ton of information at once, but I think that the benefit of a podcast, you can go back to it. So if you're watching this or listening to this and you got lost at any point, take it in steps. Learn your aperture first, learn your shutter speed next, learn your ISO after that. So don't be afraid to not understand some stuff now. I just hope that this gives you the exposure to everything you need to know, and that this can serve as a resource for learning photography in the future. This is only covering our settings though, so the next step would be shooting, which we'll be going over in next week's episode with a different guest. So say goodbye to Zack, but there's gonna be a new guest next week, and it's focused on shooting, so a little bit more about composition, a little bit more about lighting. We touched on it a bit on how it affects exposure, but more like using natural light and how to shoot and how to pose your friends, all centered around lifestyle photography. And the episode after that is going to be more about editing your photos and developing your own unique style with photography. All right, everyone, goodbye. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.
Ciao.